church, in my classes, and in my family, I am known for my passion about the environment and social justice. The challenge for me and many other Black Americans who care about the environment is that we have often had to live two lives. One in the environmental movement, and another in all the other social justice movements about which we care deeply. The environmental world has often been a predominantly white space where the urgency of the environmental crisis provides a convenient excuse to ignore issues of race, class, and privilege. In spaces dealing with issues of poverty, criminal injustice, racism, and other issues, we are told that we don't have time to talk about the future crisis of climate change when we have injustices occurring in the here and now. There are a growing list of scholars, theologians, and activists who are rejecting the notion that environmental work and human rights work should be separate. These visionaries see the connection between the oppression of people and the oppression of the planet. And they believe that the answer to many of our problems can be found in reclaiming our relationship with the earth. Dianne Glave is one such pioneering thinker. More than 10 years ago, she co-edited the book, To Love the Wind and the Rain, African Americans and Environmental History. The book looked both at the connection between African Americans and the earth and the history of racism within the environmental movement. In 2010, she published Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming the African American Environmental Heritage, in which she debunks the myth that Black people are disconnected from the planet. She traces a history that begins in Africa and the Middle Passage and ends in Michelle Obama's garden at the White House. Dr. Glave's work extends beyond the environmental movement and beyond the academy into the church. She currently serves as a minister within the United Methodist Church, dealing with issues of diversity, both in predominantly white congregations and for ministers of color, or churches of color throughout the UMC. I am so happy to have her here today. Last year, when I was taking Dr. Paris's class, I was writing a paper and I discovered her book, and it was like a breath of fresh air. I was even more excited when I called her and she was approachable, open, willing to talk, and willing to listen. In many ways, she is a role model for me in terms of the work that can be and has been done within the environmental movement, and I'm so excited to see her here tonight. Many people think about the Pope as really putting the call out to the church, and of course, his words were very important. But Dr. Glave shows that there were people even before that who have been calling on the spiritual communities to stand up and face a very impending crisis in our world. I'm so excited to hear what she has to say tonight, as I think it will be illuminating for all of us in the room. I welcome Dr. Dianne Glave.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I appreciate it. The Black church never left the outdoors. And that might seem like a tension between how African Americans are perceived. But we have long been connected to nature, connected to the environment. Before I begin, I did want to thank so many people that made it possible for me to be here with you. Marianne White Hammond got this all started. Thank you so much. Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, we have a connection to Emory University. I attended there, and she was a faculty member there. Ray Joyce, Chad Kidd, Art Gordon, and the Lowell Institute that funded my opportunity to come here. I'm so grateful for being here with all of you, to be here with all of you. So it may seem like this is a 21st century phenomenon, African Americans being connected to nature through the church, but this is not so. In a relatively recent Huffington Post article, The African American Clergy Seek to Bridge the Green Gap, it shows how even today, African Americans are making the intersection with environment and the church. And the article focused in part on Trinity United Methodist Church, Church of Christ in Chicago. And there the members were planting vegetable gardens, an organic garden. They were accessing a black farmer's market. And they actually named the garden after George Washington Carver. Anybody familiar with George Washington Carver? Who is he? I see some hands. Tell me who George Washington Carver is or was.
Great food scientist.
Great food scientist. And where did he come out of? Tuskegee, yes, and well known for sweet potatoes, the peanut, and his ideas about conservation and caring for the soil too. So they chose one of our incredible African American leaders to name the garden after. So here we see that there's a display, and they're encouraging members to shrink their carbon footprint. So is it about life and death? Is it about survival? Is it about nature as recreation? Is it more holistic in our understanding of nature? We'll take a look at all of these things. So let's consider some theology today, because we want to look at the present, but we're also going to jump to the past. For African Americans, when it comes to the connection between the environment and the church, it's a real interpretation, a real life interpretation, in part through theology. There's a focus on stewardship, and when we talk about stewardship, it's about caretaking of the environment. But historically here in the United States, this caretaking has turned into dominion, a control, an oppression and domination. And African Americans and the environment have experienced this oppression when it comes to the environment. Another area to think about are foodways. And McCurder wrote, "By any means necessary," and she pulls from the theology of Malcolm X. And we really need to do this by any means necessary, because in many of our urban areas where there are African Americans and people of color, they don't have access to fresh fruit. And we need to change this so that impoverished communities have access to the same fruits and vegetables, the same foodways that whites and affluent people have access to. And then finally, there's sustainability, saved by the sun, powered by the sun. Reverend Otis Moss coined this term for us. And as African Americans, we need to be concerned about what's going on locally in our neighborhoods. That's of primary importance. But we also need to consider the overall sustainability of this planet, because we all have a role, whether we're black, white, Latino, or Asian. We have a responsibility to sustaining the planet. So, history in connection to theology and literature. When I read that Huffington Post article that focused on the African American church's role in the environment, I had an aha moment, because there is a connection to the environment. Many would argue differently, but there is a long history with theology and literature at the foundation, where African Americans have been immersed in the environment, where African Americans have had to survive the environment, where they have been the experts when it comes to the environment. So there is a long history. And there is a holistic understanding for Africans and also African Americans. So the relationship, is it one of luxury? Is it one that involves pastime? Perhaps in part, but the core of the relationship, particularly historically, has been through survival and fully understanding and immersing oneself in the environment. So simply said, the African American church or the black church never left the outdoors. So there is a nascent diasporic eco-theology. And nascent means coming, having already been in existence. And I've talked about this in multiple ways. This idea or attitude or experience of the environment existed for both Africans and African Americans. And there are early incarnations of some of the contemporary ideas that we talk about today. A relational experience, one that called for survival, and one that saw a great understanding of the environment because Africans and African Americans were immersed in it. So there is an eco-theology of the African diaspora. There's an interconnection between the culture, the people, and the church. And the corollary could be ethical issues concerning relationship to the environment. And finally, I argue, historically, African Americans have drawn from a practical theology. These are everyday applications of life, and it came through their living experience in nature and on the land, and also surviving it. So there is the practical diasporic eco-theology. We're going to go from Africa to the United States, African spirituality to Africanisms and Protestantism, to a nascent eco-theological revolt. And we're going to do this through the eyes of Nat Turner, Linda Brent, and Clementine Hunter. But let's start off in Africa. I wanted to share with you something from my book. In the book, Rooted in the Earth, I start off with a fiction. And it's very close to the reality of the experiences of Africans and African Americans, but I wrote short fictional pieces to introduce each section, each chapter. And here's how it begins. The gatekeeper is Minka, a young man a few years beyond his initiation into manhood. He stands with his head wrapped and body draped in white before the entrance to his village's earth shrine in the yellow-white afternoon sun in Ghana. He guards a place of worship where community members offer animal sacrifices to increase soil fertility, allocate land to members of the village, ceremoniously bury their dead, and venerate their ancestors. All practices with many variations throughout West Africa. Men from the neighboring village capture Minka, battering him on the head and shoulders, and then enveloping him in a net. The kidnappers drag him to British seamen waiting on the edge of Minka's receding world, the western shores of Africa. After being imprisoned for 2 days, Minka is shoved into the dim hold of a ship filled with Africans of diverse cultures and religious beliefs. Bodies pressed together, shackled head to toe, once free in Africa, seasoned in Jamaica, and now enslaved in Alabama, the gatekeeper is forced to adopt and later embraces a new religion blending African spirituality with the Protestantism of the enslavers. So in Africa, there's some generalizations, and it's not the case in every part of Africa, every experience in Africa, but here are some generalizations when it comes to the spirituality and the environment. There's an interconnectedness of human, spiritual, and environmental realms. It's believed that harm towards or care of one necessarily affects the others. And there is a connection between agriculture and spiritual ways of being. There's the life and death in planting cycles, and this is literal, but it's also the spiritual death in life. Farmers consecrated the soil, a source of spirituality, nourishment, and a life to people. And they also looked to the soil to bury and honor their dead. They did ceremonial burials while returning nutrients to the soil. So for Africans, it was very complex. It wasn't simply, I'm going to the woods and this is my singular experience, but it all came together. Couldn't separate one from the other. So Africans went through the arduous Middle Passage, and they came here to the Americas, and I'm going to focus on North America. They were enslaved during the colonial and antebellum periods, yet they retained African spirituality and drew on the Protestantism that in some cases was forced on them, the Protestantism which was the primary religion in the U.S. And we see here in this image a brush arbor. Africans and African Americans went to the woods because it was unacceptable to whites for them to congregate in large groups together. So they often went off to the woods to worship and to have revivals. And they did this before and after enslavement here in the United States. So let's start off with Nat Turner. Nat Turner, His story comes from his confessions. And he blends the Old Testament prophet with being revolutionary. And he does this drawing on environmental themes. He was the leader of an 1831 revolt in Southampton in Virginia. There, 60 whites died, and 57 blacks were eventually executed. And Nat Turner, he had 4 visions. And keep in mind that his visions were prophetic in a Christian context and also traced with environmental descriptors. So the first vision that Nat had, he saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun was darkened. The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. And I heard a voice saying, "Such is your luck, such you are called to see, and let it come rough or smooth, you must surely bear it." So we see a bit of the prophet here as he refers to elements of the environment, as he begins to develop and grow this prophetic call that he feels to lead a revolt of other slaves. In another vision, it was revealed that the knowledge of the elements and the revolution of the planets and the operation of the tides and the changes of the seasons were another marker for Nat to continue planning his revolt. He sought to be holy, as we see is the case for many or all the prophets in the Old and the New Testament. In his third vision, he says, "I looked and saw the forms of men in different attitudes, and there were lights in the sky, to which the children of darkness gave other names than what they really were, for they were the lights of the Savior's hand, stretched forth from east to west, even as they were extended on the cross on Calvary for the redemption of sinners." So he's bringing salvation into this. He probably knows ultimately that he and his band of organizers are going to die, but there was always hope in Christ and salvation. In his fourth vision, he was working in the fields and he discovered drops of blood on the corn as though it were dew from heaven. And then found on the leaves in the woods hieroglyphic characters and numbers with the forms of men in different attitudes, portrayed in blood and representing the figures I had seen before in the heavens. He is mapping out an ecological rebellion in the context of his Christian faith. It is theological. Nat Turner saw God giving him holy permission to lay down the yoke and the sins of men, to start a revolt, to transform the culture in the United States, from those who were the enslaving and those who were enslaved. So Harriet Tubman is another central figure that some of you may know about out of African American history, particularly the enslavement of African Americans. And Harriet Jacobs, she wrote a book in 1861. It's a slave narrative, and it tells her story of how over many years she worked on trying to run away from her slaveholder, from the slaveholder. And what she does is she blends a distinctive spirituality with nature. And in one scene in the book, she's in the woods, and she's by a church and near a graveyard. And she's having recollections of her mother, and she's overcome spiritually in that place in the woods. She's in a sacred place. There's a black stump at the head of her mother's grave, and there's a tree that her father has planted. It's the stump. His grave is marked with a small wood board, and it has his name on it, but it's worn out at this point. And she passes the wreck of the old meeting house that was before Nat Turner's time. So intuitively, Jacob, she's on hallowed ground and invokes the spirit in an African, drawing from her African past. She invokes the spirit of her parents along with the enslaved insurrectionist Nat Turner. She's in a natural setting. There's a singing bird, a long dead tree. And she evokes African influences, including planting trees at graves, which symbolize an ancestral connection and a rising up to heaven. At the same time, Jacobs looked at the Protestant God for direction as she planned or continued to plan to flee. Anybody familiar with Clementine Hunter? I love her work. She is a folk artist. She was born in 1886, and she's African American, and she was born in rural northwest Louisiana. And her paintings represent the place she comes from. And this painting in particular, it's called Baptism, and it's circa 1950. She started her art career later on in life. And it's a water baptism beside a rural church that exhibits both African American and white Protestant influences. Here she depicts a pastor, perhaps an elder, church members, both men and women, and they're in white, and they're gathered near a whitewashed church close to the river. Baptism evokes the rhythms of humanity and nature and draws on the duality of African American culture. From a Protestant perspective, she draws on the New Testament template of the water and baptism ritual. And in this, from Scripture, when one is dropped down below the water, the old self dies. Does that sound familiar? And one is born again, born anew in Christ. And we see this first in the New Testament, performed by John the Baptist. The various stages of life and death, they play out in baptism on a fragment of southern landscape. And it's defined by African American sharecropping not very far from the enslaved days of Nat Turner. Hunter transforms John the Baptist's New Testament wilderness template, bordering the River Jordan, to her own place, an agrarian civilization of bottle green grass, mauve skies, symmetrical fan-like trees, and russet soil. All of these are well-known environmental markers of the daily lives of African Americans on the river. Lives defined by lingering African legacies and by the climate of racism that limited their cultural and their environmental experiences. So the future, you can't connect the future, you cannot disconnect the future from the past and the present. African Americans have a strong tie between their past, their present, and their future. They're all connected, and African Americans were very involved, did have a connection, and did intertwine their experiences. It wasn't just limited to nature, but they brought in their cultural experience, their everyday experience to the environment. African Americans, they had a practical theology, and their expertise, in part, grew out of the civil rights movement. And when I talk about the civil rights movement, it starts with someone like a Nat Turner, and it continues into what is traditionally known as the civil rights with the 1950s and 60s, with Martin Luther King and others. So let's take a look at this video. It's called The Green Church, Black Churches Going Green, and it's from 2015.
O Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the world thine hands have made. Thine hands have made. I see the stars, and I hear the rolling thunder. My power throughout the universe displayed. environmental catastrophe. The climate is changing and we're destroying it. We continue to live how we are living as if we have infinite resources and as if we can use this world up and find another one to live on. And we are in for a rude awakening.
Climate change is disproportionately affecting minority communities. Black children have the highest rates of asthma. Typically, you have a food desert, so you have individuals who don't have access to healthy food.
Ecological issues, environmental issues affect us just as closely. We just aren't able to recognize it because we assume that it's more of a national or global issue. We don't think it's as big of an issue as dead black bodies, but we're not necessarily connecting the dots that environmental issues are contributing to dead black bodies.
Reality is that the church has always been for us the major agent for community change.
We recognize that there is a connection with mass incarceration and poverty and education and voting rights, and that the environmental movement, eco-justice, is at the center of those things.
Genesis 1:26 says that God gave us dominion.
The Christian story is about recycling, isn't it? People who have been cast aside and thrown away on the garbage heap of sin and hell, being salvaged, saved.
And if our people are truly going to move forward from a dirty energy economy to a clean energy economy,
if we can do it, then they want to do it too. How can I save money? How can I make my house more efficient? How can I protect our environment?
if our people are going to strive in a green collar economy,
When you incorporate sustainability, all of a sudden people get excited about this, especially if it's an African American church.
one that creates jobs that are pathways out of poverty, then the church must set the example and the church must lead the way. God bless you and God bless you.
And I think it's so important that we, as a Black church, bring this message to the forefront so that people can take the information, assimilate it, and share it in their own communities.
What's unique is that biblically, what is many times skipped over by many people who come from a more conservative background, is that there is a demand biblically, theologically, for environmental stewardship. It is not that we are to dominate the earth, but we are to be stewards of the earth, recognizing that we are leasing space on earth and that we should leave it a better place for the next generation. Reverend Otis Moss III, senior pastor here at Trinity United Church of Christ, the greatest church this side of the Jordan. Trinity, we really believe by any means necessary here on so many levels, as one book particularly states. We have everything from our farmers market, which connects Pembroke farmers, which are African American farmers who have been in that area since about 1853. Many of them migrated from the South, escaping slavery, and set up their homes in Pembroke, which is about 60 miles from Chicago. And now building that relationship, farmers who were not connected to the larger agribusiness, connected to many of the larger supermarkets, they have been struggling to survive. We figured out that there is a faith community that can connect those farmers with a wider community in a food swamp and a food desert.
1 out of 6 people in Chicago, they don't know where their next meal will come from.
You can go to the corner and get a bag of chips or Flamin' Hots and a Pepsi. That has no nutritional value, and it's not helping your condition. It's raising your blood pressure and everything else and killing you softly as you think you're enjoying it. Whereas here, we introduce people not only to healthy eating, healthy lifestyle, drinking more water. And so you have some people who come back with their testimonies of having changed their eating habits, having lost weight, having got off of the high blood pressure medications that they were on. And it's like a miracle for us.
About 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I realized then that I needed to not only heal myself spiritually, emotionally, but also physically. And I knew that eating a good diet, eating healthy foods, eating and thinking and moving my body and really incorporating a different type of diet into my life would be important. For a while I was a vegan, then I was a vegetarian, but then I realized it's really more about just eating good food, eating real food, not processed food.
We also have the George Washington Carver Garden, which is a beautiful, wonderful garden where we teach young people about gardening and about science. We recently switched over to be a completely sustainable church. We're moving in that direction. Our board of directors voted unanimously to move in that direction. We are planning a 30-acre development. We call it 30 acres in a school instead of 40 acres in a mule, where we will have an urban farm, food hub, along with a school, and then we'll also have a federally qualified health center that will also operate on that property, along with housing and retail. And that's just one of the small things we're doing here at Trinity, along with a green roof that'll be solar powered, it'll be green, and we like to say that we're saved by the sun and we'll be powered by the sun, and we'll be providing energy for our neighborhood. So we have a lot of things that we're doing here at Trinity, working very hard by any means necessary.
I don't know if you know, but Bayview, next to San Rafael, has the highest rate of cancer. We don't have a lot of fresh, big chain stores in our community that has fresh vegetables. We have kids growing up with asthma. We also have natural occurring asbestos in this area. And I think these are the issues that have brought us together, not only faith-based, but nonprofit. We want to make sure that Bayview is a symbol for the whole world. One of the first issues that I had to deal with was high cost of energy. We were actually paying almost $60,000 a year to run the church. So what we did was went back and revamped our church. They came in and installed the solar system and the panel system. And we were able to save over $30,000 a year. Our energy bill wasn't going up at a time when everybody else was paying more for energy. Our energy bill was actually going down. And by doing that, we were able to take the monies that we saved and put that back out into the work of the church.
I had one person come to me and question what's that? And that's very unusual in a Baptist church.
Well, this video certainly resonates with me because I'm originally from Queens, New York, and you know, there were the corner stores where mainly what was available were potato chips and candy bars. I come from a place where the environment wasn't central to everyone around me, but it was certainly central to my parents because they come from Jamaica, the island of Jamaica, and my father had a little plot that he grew, his own little garden, and they took me to the island of Jamaica regularly, so I had a different sort of experience than the rumbling planes that flew down from JFK over my house every day. So there is a connection between the past and the present. Clearly, it's taken on a different scope in terms of eco-justice and environmental justice in these churches, but the strand is that the environment was central to the experiences of African Americans, and it hasn't disappeared, it continues. So historically it's about survival, it's holistic, and it's practiced. And we do see comparisons between the past and the present too, in which African Americans are suffering because they don't have fresh vegetables, but they are taking powerful steps in terms of retrofitting their churches, changing the light bulbs in their churches, and being more efficient in terms of the energy that they use in their facilities. So the African American or the Black church never left the outdoors. Thank you for your attention.
So now that we've heard from Dr. Glave, we now want to welcome Dr. Kapya John Kaoma now to come join us. He is no stranger to the School of Theology. He received his THD here in 2010. And he is the author of God's Family, God's Earth, Christian Ecological Ethics of Ubuntu. In his book, Dr. Kaoma highlights the fact that Africa is and will continue to experience disproportionate suffering as a result of climate change. However, he says that this is not just an environmental crisis, but a crisis of faith. He calls the church to embrace the ethic of Ubuntu, which is often translated, I am because you are. Dr. Kaoma challenges us to see ourselves as part of one Christian family and to be willing to sacrifice for each other. He promotes an idea of interconnectedness which is rooted in African theologies and which can offer salvation not just to Africans, but to the larger global church. We are blessed to have this pioneering theologian. Please welcome Dr. Kapya John Kaoma.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. I wish I did that, but I owe it to my professors, Professor Danielle, Professor Hart, Professor Robert, Dean Moore, and all those who formed me. I cannot thank you enough. In the last August, I was invited to present the 2015 Gunther Wittenberg's Memorial Lecture at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. I accepted the invitation before exploring the scholarship of Professor Wittenberg. Since then, I promised myself never to accept an invitation before knowing much about the speaker. And after reading Dr. Glave's work, I realized that I just broke my own promise. But I did something strange. I prayed to God that there should be snow, and God answered my prayer. But the only problem with that, it happened on the wrong date. So I have no choice but to talk about it. There is a very strong link between the African-American outdoor spirituality and the continent of Africa. But I've been thinking through this from a different perspective. And I've entitled my response as the African church and the African-American church left God outdoors. The reason for that is that my experience of an African soul or mind is that spirituality is born not from the modern building. Mostly it will be in the forest, on the mountain, or in the waters. That's where spirituality for us is born. And our God was not necessarily worshipped like the Jews would do later on during the time of Solomon, the temple. Our God was worshipped in the place filled with what we might consider to be dirt. We don't want to be unclean. People did not put on suits when they wanted to go to church to worship their God. They went the way they were until Christianity took hold, until colonialism came and told us that to go to church means you have to dress differently, and also you have to change even your own name. And so I have John because when I was born and baptized, the missionaries could not accept that Kapya can become a Christian. So they gave me John, and my twin was given Joseph. That's how we were baptized. And yet my family always call me Kapya, and I call my brother Chikulu, which means the bigger twin. Now, listening and going through the presentation this evening, what really is puzzling is the fact that there is something about an African personality which is planted in the African soul. And just as African slaves were forced to work the land, Africans were also forced to abandon their nature-respecting religions. And it seems that slavery failed to distance an African-American soul from earth, and neither did civilization, commerce, Christianity, and conquest erase earth spirituality from an African soul. In the presentation this evening, I thought of reflecting on one of the guys I really respect so much in terms of his poetry, a Zambian poet called George Musowe. This is how he presents the slaves' farewell to their mother continent. Farewell, young trees of Africa, and all the beasts of this continent. Farewell to every creature, ant, snake, cow, goat, bird, and all that dwells in its waters. This shipping shall be told to my generation. Farewell, souls of Africa, where animals nimble. This poem illustrates the attachment Africans have to their natural environment, as revealed in the ethics of Ubuntu, the realization that I am because I'm ecologically interconnected to other beings in the universe. This interconnectedness is at the heart of the Bantu community in which Bantu people exist. Thus, to possess Ubuntu is to be in just and loving relationship with the cosmos. Now, I was wondering whether talking about Africa in America is enough. I don't think it is. The African American church needs to experience Africa from the traditional worldview, undented by European colonialism and Christianity. In traditional Africa, the natural world is the meeting point of the living, the ancestors, and the divine. In this worldview, humanity and nature are interconnected. An African lives with and in nature, and one is not alive apart from the natural world. It is this worldview which needs reclaiming in the African American church and Africa as a whole. The Africa from which slaves were plucked did not cease to exist. It still exists in many forms. So in which way can the African American church reconnect with African eco-theologies and vice versa? The Green Belt movement in Kenya, founded by Wangari Maathai, and Martinus Daniel's African Earth Keepers movement in Zimbabwe can be informative to the African American eco-theologies. These activities are part of the mission Creator's Dear, the mission of the Creator God, to which Africans in the Americas and Africa are invited to participate. This is the mission of the Creator God, and we are just invited in it, both as African American and Africans on the continent. Now, to understand the sacredness of the outdoors, I propose the examination of the sense of the divine in both African American and African mind. In an African mind, for instance, God is not an abstract being. Like ancestors and other beings, God is at liberty to manifest in natural phenomena such as trees, snakes, lions, among many others. While colonial Christianity viewed such beliefs as indicative of African backwardness, something we constantly hear of the voodoo religions in the diaspora, this belief has biblical support. God, the biblical God, manifested in snakes, bushes, clouds, wind, and much more. Moreover, the incarnation is employed to show how God became human to save humanity. However, little is said about the Spirit that descended on Jesus Christ. From the Trinitarian perspective, if the first person of the Trinity revealed God's self to Moses in the burning bush, and snakes, of course, the second person came to us through the human body, while the third person came into this world through a dove and fire. Importantly, the creation as missionary agency, nature can also be possessed by and used by the Creator to communicate the Creator's will to humanity. Is it not time to rediscover the true God and our ancestors outdoors? In short, we need to re-examine our spiritualities from the perspective of the outdoors. This is because the Jesus planted in African worldviews and nature has a better chance of meeting people's daily needs, especially those who depend on the soil for their survival, as opposed to the one hanging in the Anglican and Roman Catholic cathedrals in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, whilst I appreciate that literature is important to the development of eco-theology, in Africa, traditional community rituals and rites of passage can inform Christian ecological reflections. In God's Family, God's Earth, and in the Creator's Symphony, I argue that African rituals are meant to uphold the natural workings of the earth. African spirituality, from the rites of passage to burial to ancestor veneration and to the worship of the Supreme Being as Earth's facility as its goal. From this perspective, the high god and the ancestor cults are cults of the earth, since they seek to uphold the ecological balance of the ecosphere. Despite the African theological placement of the ancestor cult in the spiritual world, ancestors are concerned with the ecological well-being of their descendants of the land their descendants occupy. Ancestors are, in fact, the owner of the land. This raises the issue of the face of Jesus Christ in Africa, in the African American church, something I hope Dr. Glave is going to do some exploration with. Is the Christ of the indoors capable of transforming African American spirituality? Further, what will it take to reconnect to the Christ of the outdoors, whose ministry was characterized with the earth? And what are the implications of eco-theology on the black church, the theology that is founded on the earth at the center of spiritual interactions? Whilst I accept and I really appreciate the argument that African Americans are recycling and working to confront human greed and its effects on life, I have a question to that. Is it enough? And is the fear of the impending crisis, ecological catastrophe, the foundation of any eco-theology? To that, I say no. Our foundation for eco-theology is built on the command that God gives to us as moral beings to care for God's own sacred garden. Whilst fear is important for us to think about, let us not forget that the church is invited to care for that which God said it was very good. And I believe that this is a spiritual challenge, because going through and working with a number of professors here at Boston University, reading their works, something really occurred to me. And this is that we are always trying to threaten people about what is coming as the way of attracting them to work on environmental issues. That cannot be sustained, and it won't work. What we need to develop is a different spirituality that we need to inculcate in ourselves and one another. The question of environmental justice, eco-justice, as important as it is, does not make us forget that less than 20% of the world population consumes over 80% of the earth's natural goods. Is it not time for us, as Christians, as men and women of faith, to rethink our values? In the exploration of eco-theology, I have found that aside from looking at what the ancestors have told us or what my tradition says, there's another element to it. And this is my last point I want to express. One thing which I am afraid of is this: when we speak about the Protestant religion, somehow we are meant to believe that everything about it was bad. Well, in my exploration of eco-theology, I found missionary documents very helpful. The ecological sensibilities of missionaries such as William Carey, a British Baptist missionary to India, David Livingstone, whom most of us know about, and Albert Schweitzer suggests the ambiguous ecological promise of the Protestant Christianity or religion, something Professor Robert and Dave Buchles identify in the new book which just came out, Creation Care in Christian Mission. Let me just read some lines from the two missionaries. In 1858, David Livingstone wrote, "I would earnestly press on you the duty of a sacred regard to life and never to destroy it." He's speaking about animal life, unless some justified end is to be answered by its extinction. The most vital part ought to be aimed at, and no shot fired unless the animal be within a range that renders it probable that the mortal part will be struck. The wanton waste of animal life, which I have witnessed from midnight hunting and from ferocious but childlike abuse of the instrument of destruction, he's talking about guns, make me anxious that none of my companions should be guilty of similar abominations. In his 1836 article, The Ethics of Reverence for Life, again, Schweitzer writes, "Humanity must reverence every form of life, seeking as far as possible to refrain from destroying any life regardless of its particular type. We happen to believe that man's life is more important than any other form of which we know. But we cannot prove any such comparison of value from what we know of the world's development. These missionaries suggest that Protestant Christianity is not entirely ecologically bankrupt. But the big question is, why did some Protestant missionaries see the sacredness of nature while others did not? Rather than answering that question here, I leave it to doctoral students to explore.
So now we have an opportunity for our panelists to dialogue with each other and also with you as the wider audience. So we have a microphone, as you can see in the center. If you could come to the microphone, even if you think that you have a loud voice, if you could come to the microphone just so that we can take people in order and for our watching audience. So feel free if you have a question. But I'm going to open up with one question that I'll address to both of you, and you can do it in dialogue. Both of you raised the question of Christian interpretations of Genesis to grant dominion to humans. As we try to reframe that thinking, what is your theological response to that, particularly in light of African and African American churches?
Better use my mic. You know, there's been a long history of dominion by whites, and it has impacted people of color, including African Americans, in enslavement and nature. And it really, it has to be flipped, because it's one in which the nature is not reverenced, but it's controlled. It's treated as utility. And the aesthetics are not appreciated. The value of the planet that we need is not highlighted, is not lifted up. And it's not just for people of color, but it's all of us who have to move from this paradigm of dominion and care for the planet. And I call even to African Americans, because often the focus can be locally because the circumstances are so dire, but we need to look across the country and globally.
I don't know where to start. I think there is, thank you for what you have said, Dr. First and foremost, when you talk about the Doctrine of Dominion, we are only talking about one part of the story. We ignore the second part of the very story in Genesis 2. And scholars, biblical scholars have argued that, in fact, the word used in Genesis chapter 2 has more to do with saving creation as opposed to dominion. Now, we want, as always, we want to use certain parts of the Bible to justify our actions. And my challenge is that we need to move away from just taking one verse as the center of our theology, but going through the scriptures. In fact, one important thing I need just to mention here is how even during the time of war, God put some commands not to destroy innocent trees, all right? Meaning that God cares beyond what we think. It is not our garden, it is not our earth, it is God's earth. And our duty is to do what God created us for, and that is care, tend the earth.
So I will address this one to Dr. Kaoma. You had some critique or some pushback around what the African American church could be doing differently. And I guess the question is, recognizing that there will be disproportionate impact in Africa because of climate change, what would you like to see the African American church, what would be your suggestions to the African American church as to how we could be better partners?
Thank you. This is something I've spoken about so many times. I really don't understand how Dr. King, Malcolm X, knew Kwame Nkrumah, knew Kaunda, no. There were no internets and other things like that we have today. But what I've seen is the disconnect between the Africa, in Africa and the Americas. There is that disconnect, but not only that, even between the African American community and the African diaspora. Here is the situation. You have some power which Africans don't have. They cannot tell the US government to put sanctions on companies registered in the US but destroying the African environment. Having you talk to those issues, I think will be very, very helpful, and Africa would definitely want you to partner with them. The second thing that the African American church needs to do, I think it is good to think of the earth and what we can do about our communities. But we no longer live in silos, we live as a global community. And in that video which we watched, one of the things that kept on coming to my mind is, where is the global aspect of global Christianity? We are brothers and sisters, regardless of the geography. And therefore, the African American church, I think, needs to get more involved in this partnership. And there is a lot happening out there. And at times, the African American church has resources to invest in solar. Why can't we work across the boundaries that the world has created, or our sad history, both as African American and Africa itself? Our sad history should reconnect us again, and we can do more if we partner and know each other and speak on behalf of each other.
So this is primarily to Dr. Glave. As you showed the video of Green the Church, which is exciting, I'm actually on the advisory committee for that, so I'm excited to see it. But where are other examples that you see of shifting? Do you think there's an awakening happening, or do you think it's still small? Where do you see the sort of larger African American church in terms of recognizing this? Because you've talked about the history, but I think if you still went to a lot of churches, people would not know the history. Do you think that's changing, shifting? Where are you excited?
I think it's changing in small ways, and when you look broadly at the African American experience, we are trending and moving towards being involved more globally, as you suggested. But I think it's kind of slow, and I think that there are limitations. And part of those limitations revolve around racism here in the United States. And sometimes it means limited resources. Sometimes it means a negative relationship between whites who have a certain vision of environmentalism and people of color who have another vision of environmentalism. So to answer your question, I think that it's happening. I think that the examples that you see up here, they're not the rule, they're the exception, but it's evolving. And I think because the United States is becoming more green and we're having more conversation about the resources and global warming, that we are increasingly becoming more involved in the conversation. But it's slow, and I think it's limited because of racism and poverty and issues around relationship. It's very difficult for people of color to often work with whites because of the history of racism and how we're often treated when we're invited to the table.
So I want to open it up. Is there anybody who has a question? Oh, Dean Lightsey.
So I want
Oh, you can come to the mic. I know you can project.
Yeah. Sorry. So I don't want us to leave this room without mentioning Flint. Okay? Because there's no way we can talk about environmental racism and the impact upon persons of color without pointing to the water crisis that's happening in Flint, largely a community of poor and persons of color, particularly African American persons. And Flint has happened unconnected from the other crises that have occurred all across America with relation to black bodies. Systemic racism. Now, I bring that up because I'm hoping to hear some connections about the impact of racism, the detrimental impact of racism, not only upon African American communities, but that has influenced the lack of connectedness, Kapya, which you talk about, between Africans and African Americans. So while there is this desire among many African Americans to be more connected to Africans, and Africans to be more connected to African Americans, what I think stands in between all of that is these stereotypes that we have of one another that's perpetuated by colonialism and racism. And unless we bring that up, unless we speak to that, all the goodwill we have in the world will not allow us to move forward. It is the kind of stereotypes that hurt my father, who was called a country boy because he decided to plant a garden in the back of our apartment complex in a city urban area, but which sustained many of our neighbors during hard times. That's that kind of impact that hurts us and keeps us from moving ahead.
And when I think about Flint, I think that there are tensions and there are fears, because this is a part of a broader history. We go back to the Tuskegee Institute and the syphilis experiments. We go back to Hurricane Katrina and those that were left behind and those faces that we saw suffering inside the dome. They were people of African descent. So I would love to see these alliances, but the systemic racism still exists and it impacts people of color negatively. I lived in LA and there were Latino children that lived 10 miles away from the ocean and they'd never seen the ocean before. So, I mean, I think we all have to take responsibility for ourselves, but I always encourage, in terms of my greater racism, work on racism and diversity, what are our white allies prepared to do to step into the void so that we can create these alliances, because often the responsibility and the initiative is left to the people of color to resolve the problems and the issues. So I call out to all of you that are here to step into the void and create those alliances and learn more about history and be proactive in terms of your voices around environmental racism.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that, Dean. I think it's an important point. I'm also tempted to say that it has happened in our nation, therefore we understand what the same companies that are donating to our presidential campaigns, the damage they have caused. I come from Zambia. If you don't know, one of the towns which is highly polluted in the world is the town of Carver in Zambia, where Anglo-America went in, did whatever damage, and then they left lead. So a lot of kids in that area are affected. They can't go anywhere. They have no choice. They know lead is killing their kids. The same thing will be said about Nigeria if you think about the damage Shell has caused. And now we are making this claim, and every time I listen about a friend, I'm saying, well, now you can talk about it. Now you can care about thousands of kids, but there are millions out there who are being poisoned in order to make this country, as Donald Trump would say, great again. So my prayer, again, that's where we can partner. That's where you can speak and you can demonstrate on behalf of a poor child who will never get on the plane, who will never get in the car. You can do that for them. Let us bring global cases. And I think that's something people don't like about Obama, is this bring the global aspect to the question of environment. Now, once we start localizing it, people will say, but it's not in my neighborhood. So what is the case for that? But if we try to say every child on earth needs to live in a safe environment, regardless whether they are born in the US or born in China or in India or in Zambia, then we'll start a movement that will surpass the politics of the moment. And I think that's what Dr. King tried to do. He brought the suffering not just of the people in America, but he thought about how racism was there in the entire continent. And we can learn something from that by becoming bigger in our claims and in our aspirations. We can change the world.
I wanted to first thank you both for letting me see some of my friends too on the screen. It was good. This is a very complex issue. We know that, right? And it is indeed racism. There's no way to get, but it's complex. We have to factor in globalization, the licentious spread of capital, unregulated, that is part of the poison that kills the earth and kills people. I was thinking about the kind of new, it's not new, but it's more exaggerated now. A kind of utilitarian individualism that is siphoned into our very theological language, especially in black churches, which has to do with dominion theology, sometimes prosperity theology, but I have Mimi Waraboko here who can tell you more about that. I think one of the things we need to think about and play with is the notions of memory and time. Often I think about memory and time and the connectedness that we can at least target or identify through liturgy. At Trinity United Church of Christ, each fall they have a Thanksgiving service and there's a special ritual, I've forgotten it. But people bring in African foods and they celebrate an incredible moment where people are transported through great memory to long memory. They come in African dress. And when you leave, there's a kind of performative strategy to this, not linear thinking, where people are translated in spirit to another space. I think that's part of the empowering work that we can do in black churches, both in Africa and here, that enables us to do more of the work around environmental justice. That's a comment.
No.
Yeah, there are places that are incorporating liturgy, and they are drawing on nature. And I've seen it in a church down in Memphis, and I'm blanking on the name of the church. They traced environmentalism through their vacation Bible school, and it had a transformative effect, I felt, on myself and the congregation during that week. So I do agree with you, the liturgy and the worship is central because it imprints on us in a different way than, say, me coming here and lecturing on a subject. We are all participants in the worship, and it is transformative, so I absolutely agree with you.
I just want to add one thing about that. In the book, I edited Creation Care in Christian Mission. The first part recognized the complexity of the issue we are dealing with and the danger of giving up and saying it is all lost. So what we did is to allow stories of success stories to tell us that we can change the world bit by bit. One of the stories there is about the African Earth Keepers, the movement in Zimbabwe, which was founded by Professor Dianne. And I'm mentioning this in that it brings all the issues we're talking about together. It was about healing the earth, of course, but it was also about economic empowerment. It was about gender in terms of how women bear much of the burden of the environmental crisis. So they had projects for women and that empowered women. And then they had programs for children that taught children about the value of creation. And the reason I'm mentioning that is we shouldn't think that we are going to, or rather, if we think about the African and African American situation of slavery, it was not one day you woke up and found that it's gone. It was people started doing small things until everyone now was on it. So my challenge is, rather than thinking this is too complex, we can't do anything, let us do small things like what we saw in that video. As small as they are, they change hearts, they spread, and one of the small things I've said is that Christian mission is like a mustard seed. That's how I look at it. No, you plant, it's the smallest of all the seeds Jesus said, but once it was planted in human soul, it can change the world. 12 men and probably 100 women and men came together on that day. We are told there are 500 that now they counted, but in that house on Pentecost, we are here today. This school is standing because of those men and women who met in Jerusalem that day. It does not underestimate what we can do if we believe God has given us this vocation.
I also wanted to mention, has anybody ever read Beloved? Sound familiar? There is a scene in the woods, Baby Suggs. She has church in the woods, and she talks about the black body, and we've been hearing a lot about the black body lately because of more recent literature. But she talks about the black body and how the black body is used, and they move their bodies in the woods, and they come together in unity. And they really, I mean, they don't always verbalize their pain, but they work their pain through the liturgy and through the worship. So if you haven't read Beloved anytime, or you haven't read it at all, I would suggest going back to that, because it's certainly a template for healing through religion and nature.
Good evening, and thank you again for your presentation and your response. As I'm listening to this, I'm reflecting on my own upbringing as a thoroughly urbanized child. I grew up around brick and cement and broken glass and chain link fences and wrought iron. And I don't say that with any sense of dread or hesitancy or really, I don't feel bad about it at all. I mean, I find comfort in the city. I find comfort in buildings. I find comfort in cement, in hard ground. I don't like dirt. I don't like nature. I don't like animals. I think they belong outside. I don't think they belong cohabiting with me. I don't like camping. I don't like hiking. I don't like fresh breeze. I close my windows and I put on air conditioning. I don't like wind blowing in my face. There's almost nothing about nature I enjoy other than the sunlight.
Yeah. What about fishing?
I hate fishing. I don't enjoy it. I just don't enjoy it. And one of the things I reflect on, I bring this up because you both talked about the importance not just of eco-justice, but of eco-theology, right? Of grounding this movement in a sense of knowing God ecologically and not just responding to fears, right? And not just responding to crises, but really a thoroughgoing theology built on this kind of appreciation of the world that God gave us. But I wonder if you could speak to the challenge of espousing that kind of theology in the context of an increasingly urbanized world where so much of the sort of African American history and literature and all of the themes that you raised about our sort of appreciation of the land and of all of that really comes from an agrarian culture and society and a past that is the past. I mean, the past. It's in memory. We are told about it for the most part. And even globally, the increasing global urbanization. So when you have, you know, a world where we're increasingly not going to have those touchstones experientially, right? Where even what Trinity is doing with bringing in, you know, a food market, you know, you have to bring in some farmers. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's a little break in our experience. It's just a little slice. Even if you take kids out to go camping, it's a break It's an other experience. How do you build a theology of an eco-theology that builds on what isn't my other experience, what isn't my vacation experience, or what isn't even my justice experience of bringing in the food to my neighborhood, but how do I appreciate the ecology in the space I am now, and given the proclivities I have now, which is for concrete and rocks and brick? How do I understand God ecologically, given that reality of my everyday experience?
Well, I'll highlight one thing, is that a couple of years ago I found out about a group in Greece that is actually started going out with sledgehammers and taking up concrete in places that they felt it didn't need to be. And one of their big reactions is that we were building concrete even between roads where you could put greenery. They were instead putting like concrete barriers in theory to prevent accidents. And so there are a lot of folks that are fighting to actually make sure that there's actual green space available to people. Because I think you're right, if you don't have any connection to it, any relationship, even in a lot of our, the parks we build in the city, we've been using, and it's beautiful, we're using these recycled tires or recycled tennis shoes, but it just means that kids actually don't touch any real ground, even at what we call the playground, right? So I do think that part of what you're raising is why the urban garden movement and a lot of other movements are saying we can't just go outside of the city to experience greenery. We actually have to fight for every bit of green space within urban cities, or else people will have no context for it. So that's one answer. Hopefully that gave you all time to have a better answer.
I will push back a little, because I mean there are a lot of places that are completely asphalt and concrete, but there are those little squares where a tree is growing out of the concrete. There are pocket parks, and one of the things that I struggle with in Pittsburgh is that in the more impoverished neighborhoods, they have parks that are green, they're pocket parks, but parents don't send their children to the parks because there are areas where there are drive-by shootings. So I understand the argument that there's no green, but there is green if you take a good look at it. If we don't pay attention to the environment, we're going to change dramatically for the worse. And that revolves around global warming. So we need to be concerned about bringing in green spaces. Even if someone doesn't like camping, if the entire planet was concrete and asphalt, we would be dead. That's all I got.
Thank you. I think there is a bit of, Nini has done a book on the urban part of, you'll talk to that. But I want us to remind you that this is a deception we have grown into, because you didn't tell me what kind of food you eat in that concrete space. And I think that is the starting point for everyone to know that, as I've said in one of my books, that unlike biblical manna, our daily bread does not come from supermarkets or from heaven, but from God's earth. So the starting point to me is to tell every one of us to think about, before you eat, before you take your cheese and whatever you love most, where did it come from? Not in the concrete, but it was planted somewhere or grown somewhere. So let us not just think about the bigger things. This is about the lifestyle changes. I know one thing, and this is something people in the diaspora have complained about. Our children, they love chicken when they're in America, because I go in the shop and I buy it, and they don't see how that chicken is killed. When I take them home and I kill that chicken, they won't eat it. And this is the bigger problem, really, because we are not shown where the things we are taking come from, and that's why we remain disconnected. We love our dogs because we don't eat them. But even when you have a pig as your pet, you cannot kill that and eat because you have a relationship with it. But look, the people we are talking about, the traditional communities, they respect that. They see the value of killing something for meat when they need it to. And I think in our concrete, I would say, please, you have apples that didn't come from the concrete space. Your dinner tonight is not coming from the concrete space. learn to appreciate where everything is coming from. To me, that's the starting of healing. It's going back to where what I put on my table comes from. If people are exploited, can be red, like we like the blueberries or strawberries, but think about the blood which comes with it. And that's how you start making choices to go to the farmer's market where ethics is employed, as opposed to going into a supermarket which disregard the rights of the workers. Those are the choices I would say you can make in the concrete space.
Also the breath. Where does the oxygen come from?
Thank you. From trees. Thank you.
I think what Theodore was saying was not said, setting up theology, eco-theology of the village or the rural versus the concrete. And I think it's missionary. What he's saying is that what is the theology, eco-theology of the urban center? Because increasingly what I would like to know, the world is living in an urban center. And so that is the question is asking. There are people who grew up like him, and no matter what you talk about romantically about all that, is not going to make sense to people like that. And you can lecture them on the importance of it, it's not going to matter. The issue is, how do we begin to think together the issue of ecology and urbanity and spirituality all in one breath? Because the world is becoming urbanized. And people who live in the city, they don't have the means to travel. And that is a question that 3 years ago, a group of us, ethicists, ecologists, urban planners, health officials have to tackle at Harvard with architects. So how do we create the modern city? Because they realize that in the next 25 years, more cities are going to be built because of the population. Not in America, but all over the world. And so how do you begin to create urban city where nature and the city is incorporated? And where you begin to talk about having awe for nature, having awe for the city and for nature, and how would that affect spirituality? So how do you replan the city in a way that you respect nature? Because our cities are planned to bring us to a place and walk and go. The cities are planned so that we don't meet. We're supposed to be strangers in the city. So how do you begin to change all that? And that is the thinking that is going on. I think that's the question is asking, because to give it that I have to give up my urban life to be eco-friendly, it's today's in a rupture, because majority of the world live in urban concrete area. And so this is the thinking that is going on. And so based on that workshop and my participation in it, that's why I wrote the book, The Charismatic City, which John is mentioning, to say, how do we exactly, there are three things that are happening. There's ecological movement, there's urbanization, and there's renewal of charismatic Christianity in different from even, or charismatic Islam. People don't like, there's also charismatic Islam going on in Africa. So these forces are coming together with globalization. How should that affect the way we plan for cities and live in cities so that we can have awe? And that is what I try to articulate by looking at the charismatic city and what should be the economic justice and peace building process in that kind of a vision for a new city. I think that is the question is asking, to say the world is going that way and we need to find eco-theology that will combine all these different aspects as one package. And I think that's the way I understood it.
Thank you.
So we have only a few minutes, but I see that we have a lot of books. So I will extend just a few extra minutes before we go across the hall or across the way. It's not even across the hall; it's on the other side of that wall for our reception. Dr. Callahan, were you raising your hand also?
I was, but where am I in queue?
I wasn't sure. I thought you were next, but I also know that. So we'll have the two of you will be the last two speakers.
Thank you very much. Then I'll be brief. I'd like to return to that question about, well, not the question, but the fait accompli of urbanization, as though that's something that we should accept. If you look at the cities that are being built now all over the world, I think they all leave something to be desired. A city that has 35,000 people, 40,000 people, that's not a livable space for anyone. So my question would be where, if and how the two presenters have encountered alternatives, people who are thinking, who haven't surrendered to the urbanization that people are saying is just going to be our lot in life. And I'd just like to suggest a thought experiment, since several people have referred to reflection on what's happened in the past and history and ancestors, and the kind of urbanized orientation even of our understanding of African American struggles. Those are struggles that take place in the big cities. Those are struggles that take place even in the South, the Birminghams and so on. But if you could imagine African American history being told from an agrarian perspective, that one of the most important things that happened in the 1930s wasn't the Harlem Renaissance. It was the struggle of agrarian black people, armed struggle, in the South, and their partnership with the Communist Party, of all things. A very important moment in African American history, and it warrants a lot of attention. It gets virtually none. But there, the struggle for land, which is the source of all wealth, and we didn't have to wait for Marx to tell us that. Your ancestors told us that centuries ago. The struggle for land that people are going to lose in the 21st century when they're urbanized. They're not going to be homeowners. They're going to be proletarians. They're going to be people in debt. So, and there many of them are going to be unemployed, and many of them are going to be children. So an alternative that would embrace a future that had land, that had green spaces, and that had experience for people to enjoy some of the things that were mentioned in the presentation, something I'd be very interested in hearing from the presenters. Thank you.
And I'm actually going to have us do both questions and then close out. And then I know that Dr. Callahan has done a lot of work in Brazil, where actually there are urbanized people who are now moving out of cities back out and claiming land in rural areas in recognition of some of these challenges.
Well, I wanted to go back to the first question, which was this idea of dominion versus stewardship. And I heard once that God gave us dominion when we were still in the Garden of Eden, and then when it was clear that we had disappointed him in terms of our level of consciousness, that's when the language changed, and we weren't given that responsibility, but it was really to take care of things. And I also want to say something as chair of the Massachusetts Sierra Club, that the issue of climate change has made this national organization, which I'm a chapter here in Massachusetts, realize that we can't win this if one group is doing this and another group is doing that. That everything that we're doing is connected, and it's such a huge existential threat that it's clear that this is our, I guess, our major test of consciousness. Are we gonna get up to the level that we were given credit for originally as humanity, and come together and and really tackle this, or are we gonna take the food shortages and the water shortages and all these other things to actually tear us asunder?
So we will now ask you in your closing statement to address both this question of, is urbanization a fait accompli, and then also how is this sort of impending challenge of climate change possibly bringing us together, also the question of dominion. And my closing charge to you was going to be that this is part of our celebration of Dr. King's birthday. And so if you can channel all of those things into your final statement. And then just so you know, after we hear from our speakers, we will be next door, and there will be some refreshments and plenty of space for us to continue this dialogue.
Well, Dr. King, before he was assassinated, he went to support the sanitation workers in Memphis. He took his theological being down to that area and spoke up for sanitation workers in an urban setting. So I do know that it can happen in the urban setting. I may have to leave it to some of our PhD students, and I need to think about this more, but I think that this urban piece is really critical. As for all of us working together, I mean, I was born in the 1960s, and I do struggle with our capacity to cross lines of religion and race and ethnicity and gender, but we have to do it because the planet needs us. And we need to continue to have these conversations, and we need to be willing, we need to be open to comments around, well, where are we in terms of the urban piece, and where are we in terms of working with one another, because God calls us to do this. So I don't have all the answers, but you started me thinking along another line, and I'll continue to think about it, and I hope that we can continue to have conversations so that the theology speaks to urbanites.
Talking about Dr. King, the agents of now. I'm sure when they start talking, white communities start to discuss the question of civil rights. Some white person would have stood up and said, I don't like black people, I don't trust them. But after a lot of exposure to the cause, that person could have changed and become part of the supporters of the cause. And the biggest problem we have with urbanization is that if we don't care, and this is something important, and name is out, but I want you to hear that. If we don't care for the earth now, we are not going to survive in the city, we like it or not. Already we are seeing that happening across the world. Violence is on an increase. Many people will be depressed, and once they are depressed, they'll do something stupid. There is healing in relating to the earth. And rather than thinking that the norm is urbanization, maybe we need to ask a question, on what cost are we going to do that? And I believe that if you are planted in the natural environment, that's where we belong. There is a form of healing that comes with that. So, in as much as I understand that it is a hard topic to try and address, or the distance which is involved in this, what I can tell you is that the urgence of now, ask yourself, what kind of earth are you going to leave for your niece, your grandchild? We are living on their blood and thinking that this will continue. The urbans are going to close, and we have seen it. This is one thing I like about snowstorms, because even the rich, they won't get out. And we know that. That's the starting point. Let's ask ourselves that question. Once nature speaks, there's no city anymore.
Thank you so much.